Sarah had no idea that renting a room from Carl Wilkes would lead her into the darkest secret of her life. What started as a quiet escape from her past quickly turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse, where every step she took closer to the truth brought her deeper into the clutches of a man who had buried more than just his memories. Hayesville was a town that seemed stuck in time. Nestled in the heart of Texas, it was surrounded by endless fields of golden wheat and sparse patches of forest. The small town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the most exciting thing to happen was a parade or the arrival of a new store. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, their faces worn with age, but still standing strong, carrying the weight of a history few people bothered to recall. It was in this sleepy town that Sarah Bennett, a 23-year-old college student, found herself looking for a place to stay. Sarah had moved to Hayesville from Austin, hoping to escape the noise of the city and focus on her studies. She was attending a small university on the outskirts of town, and the quiet life was exactly what she needed to finish her degree. She didn't expect to find anything fancy. She just wanted something affordable and relatively close to school. When she saw the listing for a room to rent in an old house on Maple Street, she figured it would do. The rent was cheap, and it was within walking distance of the university. The house was old, but that didn't matter to Sarah. It was an old house after all, something that added character, and she liked the idea of living somewhere that had a history. The house itself was a 2-story Victorian with a wraparound porch. The paint on the exterior was chipped and faded, and the windows were clouded with years of dirt, but it still had an undeniable charm. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the fence surrounding it was crooked in places, as though time had gradually bent it out of shape. When Sarah first arrived, she didn't think much of the exterior. It just looked like an old house, and there were so many like it in small towns. But when she rang the bell, Carl Wilkes opened the door, and that's when the strange feeling began. Carl Wilkes was an old man in his late 70s, with a thin graying beard and deep, sunken eyes that never seemed to blink. He wore a faded plaid shirt and overalls, and his movements were slow, as though he was weighed down by something invisible. His house was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn over every window. The air inside had a strange, musty odor that clung to the walls, and the furniture was old. None of it seemed to match, and everything had the appearance of being slightly out of place. But what stood out the most was Carl himself. There was something unsettling about him. He had a quiet demeanor, yet his presence seemed to fill the room in a way that made Sarah uneasy. Carl showed her the room she would be renting. It was on the second floor, a small room with just enough space for a bed and a desk. The walls were bare, and the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. The only window was narrow, offering a view of the overgrown backyard and the woods beyond. Sarah tried not to show her discomfort, thinking that maybe she was just being paranoid. After all, she needed a place to stay, and it seemed like Carl wasn't a bad guy, just an eccentric old man living alone in a house that had seen better days. But as the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Carl would appear at odd hours, walking slowly down the hallway or standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at her door. He never seemed to knock before entering, and whenever Sarah mentioned it, he would apologize in a way that made it feel like an odd sort of habit rather than an accident. She found herself becoming more cautious around him, always locking her door when she was inside and avoiding direct interaction whenever possible. She knew it was probably nothing, just her overactive imagination, but she couldn't help it. Something about Carl Wilkes didn't sit right with her. At night, when Sarah lay in bed, she would hear strange sounds coming from the basement, scraping noises, heavy footsteps, and the occasional clattering sound that made her heart race. Carl had explained that the house was old, and the creaks and groans were just the sound of the building settling. But the sounds continued, and Sarah started to feel as though she wasn't alone in the house, even when she was. Something was hidden in those walls, and whatever it was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. But Sarah had no idea just how close she was to uncovering the truth. The more she stayed in that house, the more she felt like she was walking a fine line between curiosity and danger. Little did she know, her search for answers would lead her into the heart of a dark, twisted mystery that no one in Hayesville had ever expected to find. From the moment Sarah settled into the house, she began to notice things that seemed just a little off. At first, there were small details. Shadows in the corners of her room, a slight chill in the air that didn't seem to fit with the warm Texas afternoons, and the unsettling creak of floorboards at odd times of the day. But as the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences began to multiply. She started to feel as though the house itself was watching her. Carl, too, became an increasingly perplexing figure in Sarah's life. On the surface, he seemed like the harmless old landlord of a rundown property, but there was an underlying oddity about him that Sarah couldn't ignore. For one, he rarely left the house. He would appear early in the morning, go into his office at the back of the house, and then not be seen again for hours. His presence was a ghostly one, and though she occasionally caught glimpses of him from a distance, he seemed to vanish as soon as she looked away. When he did speak to Sarah, his conversations were strange, almost disconnected. He would ask her how her day was going, but in a way that made it sound like he wasn't really interested in the answer. He would often stare at her with those deep, sunken eyes, making her feel as though he was studying her, like she was part of some puzzle he was trying to solve. Sarah tried to be polite, but his gaze was unnerving, and his awkward silences made her skin crawl. She wondered if he was simply lonely or if there was something more sinister at play. Carl's odd behavior didn't end there. She noticed that he always seemed to be watching her from the window of his office, his silhouette barely visible behind the curtains. He never waved or acknowledged her, but she would often find him staring at her for long stretches of time, his eyes unwavering. She tried to shake it off as nothing more than the behavior of an eccentric old man, but something told her it was more than that. It was as if Carl was hiding something. Something about her. Something about the house. Something he wasn't ready to reveal. One night, Sarah decided to confront her growing unease head-on. She had heard the noises again, the strange scraping and thumping coming from the basement. It was late, long after Carl had gone to bed. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic creak of the house settling. It was then that she decided to investigate. After all, she couldn't ignore her suspicions any longer. She had to know what was going on, whether it was a figment of her imagination. With a flashlight in hand, Sarah made her way down to the basement. The stairs groaned beneath her feet, and she held her breath as she stepped into the dimly lit space below. The basement was musty, filled with forgotten furniture and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. As she moved deeper into the room, she noticed that the air felt colder here, and the silence was almost suffocating. She couldn't explain why, but something pulled her toward the far corner of the basement, where a large stack of old crates sat against the wall. Without thinking, Sarah pushed the crates aside, revealing a hidden door. The door was small, almost unnoticeable, and covered in years of dust. It was locked, but she could feel the cold, heavy presence behind it. Something had been sealed away, and it was waiting for her to find it. Her heart raced as she ran her fingers over the cold metal lock. For a moment, she hesitated. What if this was a mistake? What if she was about to uncover something she wasn't supposed to know? But the curiosity won out. She couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, she pried open the lock, and with a shaky hand, she opened the door. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. The room was small and cramped, the air thick with the smell of rot and mildew. The walls were lined with old photographs, yellowed newspapers, and personal mementos that didn't belong to her. But the most unsettling thing was the blood-stained carpet, its edges frayed and worn, hidden beneath the floorboards. The bloodstains were old, but unmistakable. It was a chilling sight, one that sent a wave of dread crashing over Sarah. Suddenly, everything started to make sense. The strange behavior, the hidden door, the sounds in the basement. It was all connected. Carl wasn't just an eccentric old landlord. There was something darker at play here, something he had been hiding for years. But Sarah had just stumbled upon a secret so terrible, so horrifying, that she wasn't sure she would ever be able to escape it. Her mind raced as she stood frozen in that basement, staring at the evidence of something horrific that had happened long before she ever arrived. She knew then that she had uncovered something far worse than she could have ever imagined. And now, there was no turning back. As Sarah stood in the basement, her breath caught in her throat. The hidden room, with its blood-stained carpet and collection of old, forgotten items, felt like a chilling glimpse into a past that had been deliberately concealed. She could feel the weight of the air around her, thick with the secrets it held. Her mind raced as she scanned the room, trying to make sense of what she had discovered. The photographs on the walls were blurry and faded, some too old to make out clearly. But there were enough recognizable faces to make her stomach churn. These weren't just random photos. They were of people who had once lived in the house, and one of them looked strangely familiar. It was a woman, her face youthful and bright, but with a sadness in her eyes that made Sarah uneasy. The woman's name was barely legible beneath the photograph, but she thought she could make out the name Emily. There was something about her smile, something that made Sarah feel like she had seen her before. She tried to shake off the feeling, but the thought lingered in the back of her mind. Was this a previous tenant, a person who had once lived here, just like her? And if so, why had she been so carefully preserved in these old pictures? Sarah's eyes moved quickly from the photographs to the old newspapers scattered on the floor. They were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the headlines were clear enough. Missing woman found dead in old house, and investigation into disappearance of young woman at standstill. The articles dated back years, decades even, and each one mentioned a woman named Emily Walker. The same woman in the photograph. But as she read further, the details began to disturb her. The report said that Emily had been living in this very house, renting a room not unlike Sarah's, before she disappeared without a trace. The police had never found her, and no one had ever seen her again. The mystery of her disappearance remained unsolved. But now Sarah knew Carl Wilkes, the man who owned this house, had to have known something. How could he not? Sarah's pulse quickened as she crouched down to examine the blood-stained carpet more closely. The stains were dark, old, but they were unmistakably blood. She couldn't look away, her mind racing as she tried to connect the dots. She had found this room by accident, but now it seemed impossible to deny what had happened here. The blood wasn't just an accident. It was a deliberate act, a part of something far darker than she could ever have imagined. Suddenly, the silence of the basement felt unbearable. The sound of her own breathing echoed in the small room, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The walls of the house, which had once seemed so familiar, now felt like a prison. Carl's presence was everywhere, lurking just beyond the edges of her awareness. She thought of the strange way he had been acting lately, his distant stares, his reluctance to answer her questions. He had never been open with her about the house's history, but now she understood why. She needed to leave. She needed to tell someone, anyone, about what she had discovered, but the thought of confronting Carl terrified her. She had no idea how he would react. Would he deny everything? Would he try to silence her just as he had silenced Emily? The chilling thought lingered, and for the first time since moving in, Sarah felt a real sense of danger. With trembling hands, she backed away from the room, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. What had happened to Emily? Was she just another victim of Carl's dark past? Or had something else happened that she couldn't yet understand? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but one thing was certain. Whatever Carl was hiding, it was far worse than she had initially believed. She needed proof. She needed to know more about Emily's disappearance, to dig deeper into the house's history, and to understand the true nature of Carl's involvement. But she also knew that time was running out. Carl was still in the house, and as the realization dawned on her, Sarah knew that she had to act quickly, before Carl realized what she had found. Every moment she stayed in that house brought her closer to a terrifying truth, and now there was no turning back. Sarah spent the next few days in a haze, consumed by the images she had discovered in the basement and the chilling implications they carried. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows made her heart race. Carl seemed to grow more elusive by the day, retreating further into his office or disappearing for long stretches of time. She couldn't help but wonder if he knew she was on to him, if he could sense her growing unease. But Sarah couldn't ignore what she had uncovered. The photographs, the blood-stained carpet, the old newspaper articles. It was all too much to dismiss. The woman in the photographs, Emily Walker, was still haunting her thoughts. What had happened to her? Why had she vanished without a trace, and why had Carl kept her memory alive in such a disturbing way? Sarah had to know more. One evening after Carl had gone to bed, Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. She had to confront him. The knowledge she had found in that hidden room gnawed at her every second, and she couldn't keep silent any longer. She needed answers. She needed to hear it from him. Carl had to explain what had happened to Emily, and why it seemed like the house had a history of hiding its darkest secrets. As the house grew still around her, Sarah made her way down the narrow hallway, her breath shallow. The house felt different now, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in around her. She reached Carl's office door and hesitated. Her hand lingered on the doorknob, her mind racing with the consequences of what she was about to do. But there was no turning back. She had to ask. With a firm turn of the knob, she stepped into the dimly lit office. Carl was sitting in his chair, staring blankly at the wall, his face expressionless. He didn't acknowledge her at first, and the silence between them felt suffocating. "Mr. Wilkes," Sarah began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. "I need to know about Emily, the woman in the photos. What happened to her?" Carl's eyes snapped to hers, his face tightening in a way that made Sarah's blood run cold. For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze was unwavering, but there was something in his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't fear, but something darker, something more calculating. "She's gone," he finally muttered, his voice low and hoarse. "She left. She didn't want to stay. That's all." Sarah's mind spun. The answer was too simple, too dismissive. She could see the cracks in his story already, but there was more. She couldn't just let him get away with it. She pressed on, her voice firm despite the fluttering in her chest. "Are there bloodstains in the basement, Mr. Wilkes? Why did you keep those photographs, those mementos? They're not just memories. They're a record of someone's life and death." Carl's face darkened, his eyes flashing with something that could only be described as anger. His hand clenched into a fist, but he didn't speak. Sarah could feel the air in the room thickening, his silence stretching on, suffocating her with its weight. "You don't know what you're asking, girl," Carl finally spat, his voice thick with venom. "Some things are better left buried. You think you can just waltz in here and uncover the past? You think you're entitled to know?" The intensity in his voice made Sarah's knees go weak. She stumbled backward, but she couldn't look away from him. There was no denying the malice in his tone, the way he seemed to tower over her, even sitting in his chair. He wasn't just a landlord. He was a man, hiding something dangerous, something deadly. She had underestimated Carl. She had assumed he was just an eccentric old man with a few skeletons in his closet, but now she understood. He was a man who had buried his past for a reason, and he would stop at nothing to keep it that way. Sarah realized in that moment that her discovery in the basement had put her in more danger than she could have ever imagined. Carl was hiding something far worse than she had ever anticipated, and she was now tangled in his web. She knew, deep down, that the longer she stayed in the house, the closer she came to becoming part of that twisted history. But she couldn't leave, not yet. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something even darker still waiting to be uncovered, something that Carl was desperate to keep buried. As she turned to leave the office, Carl's voice followed her, low and menacing. "If you know what's good for you, you'll forget about this. Go back to your room. Forget you ever came here." But Sarah couldn't forget. Not now. She had seen too much, and she was more determined than ever to get to the truth, no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur of tension and fear. Sarah could feel Carl's presence looming over her, even when he wasn't physically in the room. She had tried to ignore the knot of dread tightening in her stomach, but it was impossible. Every shadow seemed to be hiding something, and every creak of the house was a reminder that she was trapped. Trapped in a house filled with dark secrets and a landlord who was more than just eccentric. Carl Wilkes had made it clear that she needed to stop asking questions, but Sarah knew she couldn't. She was too deep into this now, and the truth was something she couldn't ignore, no matter how dangerous it became. That night, as the wind howled outside, Sarah couldn't sleep. The darkness seemed to press in on her, the house creaking and groaning like a living thing. She lay awake, her mind racing with everything she had learned about the house, about Carl, about Emily, the bloodstains in the basement, the photographs, the newspaper clippings. They were all connected. Emily had disappeared. But what if she hadn't just disappeared? What if she had been murdered? What if Carl had something to do with it? Sarah knew she had to get out of the house, but part of her was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't leave without knowing the whole story. She couldn't walk away until she had answers. She had to confront Carl, had to dig deeper into the house's past, even if it meant putting herself in danger. That night, as Carl went to bed, Sarah made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait any longer. She had to go back into the basement, had to explore every corner of the house until she found the truth. Carl had warned her to stop, but his threats only made her more determined. She couldn't back down now. She waited until the house was completely silent, and then, with the same flashlight she had used before, she crept down the stairs. The air in the basement was cold, almost biting, and the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. She walked toward the hidden door again, her heart pounding in her chest. There had to be more to this than just photographs and old memories. She needed to find something tangible, something that would prove, once and for all, that Carl was hiding something horrible. Sarah pushed aside the crates once again, her hands trembling. The lock on the door was still there, the metal cold against her fingers, but this time she didn't hesitate. She unlocked the door and pushed it open with a creak. The room beyond was just as she had left it, but now, with the full weight of her fear and the knowledge of what might have happened in that space, it felt even more suffocating. She stepped inside, the flashlight's beam cutting through the thick darkness, and her eyes immediately went to the far corner of the room, where the carpet was stained with dark, old blood. But there was something new now, something she hadn't seen before. In the dim light, she could make out a small, tattered box on the floor. It was hidden under a pile of old newspapers, almost as if it had been placed there on purpose. Sarah approached it cautiously, her breath shallow. As she knelt down and lifted the box, her hands shook violently. The lid creaked open, revealing a collection of items that made her stomach twist. Inside the box were more photographs, newer than the ones she had seen in the basement before. These pictures were of Emily, and they were taken in the very house Sarah was living in. The images were intimate, showing Emily in different rooms of the house. Her eyes filled with fear, as though she had known something terrible was coming. But the final photograph made Sarah's blood run cold. It was of Emily lying on the floor of the basement, her body twisted in an unnatural way, her face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. The bloodstains on the carpet were from her, Sarah realized, her mind reeling from the revelation. Emily hadn't just disappeared, she had been murdered. Before Sarah could process the full weight of what she had discovered, she heard something, a noise, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Carl was coming. Panic flooded Sarah's body, and she quickly shoved the box back into its hiding place, trying to make it look as though nothing had been disturbed. She turned off the flashlight and scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. In a blind rush of adrenaline, Sarah bolted for the door, but before she could reach the stairs, a figure appeared at the top of the basement. Carl. His eyes were cold, his face twisted into a grimace of anger. "I told you to leave it alone," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah froze, her mind racing. She had uncovered the truth, but now Carl was standing between her and the door. He wasn't going to let her walk away. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling.